29 May 1966. Where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? T.S. Eliot, Choruses from the Rock, 1934. Sunday, 29 May 1966, 50 years to the day, is undoubtedly the most tragic day in Igbo history. It is the launch date of the Igbo Genocide carried out by Nigeria and its close ally Britain. The most gruesome, devastating, and expansive genocide in 20th century Africa. Nigeria and Britain murdered 3.1 million Igbo, a quarter of this nation's population, between 29 May 1966 and 12 January 1970, during the three phases of the genocide. Subsequently, since 13 January 1970, as Nigeria launched phase 4 of the genocide, hundreds of thousands of additional Igbo have been murdered, including those murdered during the Muhammadu Buhari's current position in power, especially beginning November 2015, and this has continued unabated. The Igbo genocide is a foundational genocide of post-European conquest Africa. Not since Germany's genocide against the Herero, Nama, and Berg Damara peoples of Namibia in the early 1900s had any African nation been subjected to such indescribable barbarity and carnage as the Igbo during the course of those 44 gory months. The genocide continues in multi-forms and features. In the wake of the 28 March 2015 poll for president in Nigeria, some very influential and easily recognizable public figures in the country, including Rilwan Akiolu, the King or Oba of Lagos, West Region, and even intellectuals, including especially a United States domiciled cardiologist, called publicly for the mass murder of the Igbo because the Igbo electorate had voted overwhelmingly against the APC political party in Nigeria. Such has been this open season of staggeringly virulent pronouncements of Igbo hate and worse. Indeed, new head of regime Muhammadu Buhari, since March 2015, has continued the genocide against Igbo people. Buhari has essentially turned Biafra into a free fire zone where his occupying troops and adjunct Boko Haram and Fulani militant forces have tactically picked and chosen where and when and what targeted firing range to murder the next Igbo child, woman, or man has the grim records of the committed murders by the tripartite amalgam in the following population layouts in Biafran cities, towns, and villages attest chronologically, beginning on the 15th of November 2015 to this date. Onitsha, Igwe-Ọcha, Ubulukwu, Asaba, Ọka, Enugu, Aba, Igwe-Ọcha, Asaba, Enugu, Igwe-Ọcha, Onitsha, Uzowani, Onitsha. The Igbo genocide is thus the longest and most remorselessly sustained genocide of the contemporary era. This genocide inaugurated Africa's current age of pestilence. Yakubu Gowon headed the regime in Nigeria that launched the genocide, and Obafemi Awolowo, a lawyer, a senior advocate of the Nigerian bar, was his deputy, effectively the prime minister, the genocidist chief theorist for the campaign, and head of the all-powerful finance ministry. Awolowo also principally initiated and programmed Phase 4 of the genocide, that's the ongoing phase, aimed strategically to dismantle, degrade the Igbo economy in perpetuity. The Igbo economy, pre-genocide, was Africa's most dynamic and resourceful. Elsewhere, beginning in 1969, regime Awolowoists were in the forefront in formulating and implementing Nigeria's post-genocide decision to abolish the teaching of history in its schools as part of its broad package of measures to erase the history of the genocide from countrywide consciousness and the larger world, and thus deny its occurrence. 30 years on, in 1999, these same regime operatives played a key role in Nigeria's perverse proclamation of 29th of May as the country's new annual Democracy Day, a desperate, albeit belated effort to try to neutralize the historic import of 29 May 1966 for Igbo people, if not celebrate the genocide itself, as some of the leading genocidists of this wing of the Nigerian genocide said, such as Benjamin Adekunle, Oluwole Rotimi, Olusegun Obasanjo, and Obafemi Awolowo himself, have indeed demonstrated in their high-profile, bloated commentaries and memoirs on the genocide during the slaughtering and subsequently. 29 May 1966 was the day that Igbo people were subjected to an overwhelming violence and unremitting brutality by supposedly fellow countrymen and women. This atrocity was clinically organized, supervised, and implemented by the very state, the Nigeria state, which the Igbo had played a vanguard role to liberate from the British conquest and occupation from the 1930s to October 1960. Consequently, the genocide was perpetrated with full complicity of the British government led by Harold Wilson. At the apogee of the genocide, 1968 to 1969, Harold Wilson insisted on record that he, Harold Wilson, would accept, quote, would accept 500,000 dead Biafrans if that was what it took, unquote, Nigeria to destroy the Igbo resistance to the genocide. This is found in the book by Roger Morris entitled Uncertain Greatness, Henry Kissinger and American Foreign Policy, published in 1977. The Nigerian subalterns on the ground in this southwest Central Africa region, the boys, indolent, toady, virulently and vindictively anti-African operatives, handsomely obliged their massa, slaughtering far beyond the grim Wilson target of 500,000 Igbo, or 4.2% of the Igbo population, by January 12, 1970. The Nigerians had instead murdered 3.1 million Igbo, 25% of the nation's population. Essentially, Harold Wilson, an elected politician, a politician in Britain, an advanced West democracy, indeed the leader of the British Labour Party, had authorized and managed his country's support for the perpetration of the Igbo Genocide, this foundational genocide of post-European conquest Africa, 21 years after the end of the deplorable Jewish genocide by Germany in Europe, in which 6 million Jews were murdered. Furthermore, Harold Wilson would accept 500,000 dead Biafrans if that was what it took declaration became the defining template of the diminution of African life which formed the context of Nigeria's continuation of the Igbo genocide beyond 12 January 1970. Further genocide in Rwanda in 1994, Congo-Kinshasa or Zaire or Democratic Republic of the Congo, variously since the late 1990s, and Darfur, Nuba Mountains, South Kordofan, all in the Sudan since 2003, and in other wars on the continent. The grisly total of 15 million Africans have been murdered across the continent in these genocides and other wars since Nigeria launched the Igbo genocide in May 1966. Back to the state in Nigeria, now violently taken over by murderous anti-African socio-political forces in 1966, it had pointedly violated its most sacred tenet of responsibility to its Igbo citizens: provision of security. Instead of providing security to these citizens, the Nigeria state murdered 3.1 million of them, or a quarter of their population. The words in Hausa of the ghoulish anthem of the genocide, broadcast uninterruptedly on state-owned Kaduna radio and television throughout its duration, and with editorial comments on the theme regularly published in both state-owned New Nigeria daily newspaper and the weekly Gaskia Tafi Kobo during the period, were unambiguously clear on the key objectives of this crime against humanity. Muje kwa kashe nyamiri. Mu kashe mazansu da ya mazansu. Mu chi matansu da ya matansu. Mu kwashe kayansu. English translation: let's go murder the damned Igbo. Murder their men and boys. Rape their wives and daughters. Cut off their property. Yet, this 29th day of May 1966 is also the Igbo Day of Affirmation, Recovery, and Freedom. The Igbo people resolved on this day, the day that marked the beginning of the genocide, to survive the catastrophe. This was the day the Igbo ceased to be Nigerian forever. Right there on the grounds of those death camps in the Sabongeri residential districts of North Nigeria, and offices and churches and schools and colleges and shops and markets and hospitals and rail stations and trains and coach stations and coaches and trucks and airports and planes and highways and village tracks and brooks and rivers and gorges and bridges and woods across Nigeria. They created the state of Biafra in its place and tasked it to provide security to the Igbo and prevent Nigeria, a genocide state, from accomplishing its dreadful mission. The heuristic symbolism defined hitherto by 1st of October 1960, date of the presumed restoration of independence for peoples in Nigeria from the British occupation, shattered in the wake of this historic Igbo declaration. For the Igbo, the renouncement of Nigerian citizenship is the permanent Igbo indictment of a state that had risen thunderously to murder one of his constituent peoples. The Igbo could not have survived the genocide if they still remained Nigerian. They rightly chose the former course of their fate and not the latter, which they decisively cast adrift. Consequently, Nigeria collapsed as a state with scarce prospects. Despite the 4 murderous years of comprehensive land, naval, and aerial siege of Biafra by the genocidists, unprecedented blockade imposed on no other peoples elsewhere in recent African history, the Igbo demonstrated a far greater creative drive towards constructing an advanced civilization in Biafra than what Nigeria has all but wished it could achieve in the past 4 decades. Nigeria Burocho. Nigeria Meralo. Surely Nigeria couldn't recover from committing this heinous crime, this crime against humanity. This is its epitaph. The right to self-determination is for every people. It is inalienable and is guaranteed by United Nations. No people is exempt from exercising this right. This is why the slogan that proclaims such gibberish as indivisibility, indissolubility, indestructibility of a state, any state, is not really worth the paper it is written on, except of course it is an embedded code by a slaughtering horde for the plot of the next genocide or the reinforcement of an ongoing genocide, as indeed the world has witnessed most tragically across several regions in Africa since Nigeria and British allies' launch of the Igbo Genocide on 29 May 1966. As everyone probably knows, the states that Europe created in Africa in the aftermath of its November 1884 to February 1885 Berlin Conqueror Conference on the latter cannot provide the fundamental needs of African peoples. This Berlin state, with its fatuous and ahistorical name, Nigeria, Niger, Guinea, the Sudan, Chad, whatever, cannot lead Africans to the reconstructive changes they deeply yearn for after the tragic history of centuries of occupation. Such change was and never is the mission of the state, but an instrument to expropriate and despoil Africa by the conquest indefinitely. Essentially, the Berlin state still serves the interests of its creators and those of the ruthless cabal of murderers and kakistocratic African overseers, which polices the dire strait of existence that is the lot of the Africans currently. For the record, it mustn't be forgotten that the Hausa Fulani Islamist leadership in Nigeria, which ritually trumpets the Ind Three Sons slogan just highlighted, to preface his next planned massacre of the Igbo in Nigeria or occupied Biafra as Monday, 25th April 2016 sadistic savagery unleashed on Uzo Owani shows, had indeed infamously regarded the British conquest state called Nigeria indivisible, indissoluble, indestructible during the course of those 30 momentous years, 1930s to October 1960, by opposing the Igbo-led restoration of independence movement for the freeing of the constituent African nations and peoples from the British occupation. Britain duly rewarded the Islamist leadership perpetual control of Nigeria as a prop to transfer the latter's retrograde view of this conquest state to some post-conquest variation on the theme which in itself guarantees British suzerainty over Nigeria indefinitely. This is a cardinal feature that constitutes the tragedy called Nigeria today. As in Berlin, the state is not a gift from the gods. On the contrary, the state is a relationship painstakingly formulated and constructed by groups of human beings on our planet Earth to pursue aspirations and interests envisioned by these same human beings within a shared historical and geographical articulation. The African humanity is presently gripped in a grave crisis for survival. Surely, it is aware of this emergency, and it is now time that it abandoned the contrived Berlin state in order to survive. This state is a bane of African existence. African nations, namely the Igbo, Ijaw, Acholi, Wolof, Yao, Ibibio, Ashanti, Tonga, Baganda, Mende, Bakongo, Gikuyu, Bambara, Luba, Luo, etc., remain the basis for the regeneration of Africa's development. These nations are the sites of the continent's intellectual and other cultural creativity, not Nigeria, Niger, the Sudan, the Congo, the Guinea, whatever. The Igbo are in the throes of restoring their sovereignty in their Biafran homeland. In the past 50 years, the Igbo have written a stunning essay on human survival and resilience, a signpost of the resilient spirit of human overcoming of the most desperate, unalterably brutish forces in Nigeria. Genocide is a crime against humanity. It is crucial to remind all those involved in the perpetration of the Igbo genocide, wherever they are domiciled, that there is no statute of limitations in international law in the apprehension, prosecution, and punishment of persons or institutions involved in the crime of genocide. Igbos seek and will achieve justice for the perpetration of this crime against his people, a crime against humanity. It doesn't matter how long it takes, Igbos seek and will achieve the restoration of Biafra. It is within this context that the current heightened political developments in Biafra become intelligible. Since Friday, the 6th November 2015, hundreds of thousands of peaceful and disciplined Biafrans have turned their cities and towns and villages into panoramic Freedom Park marches, unprecedented in Africa, demanding the restoration of the sovereignty of their beloved Biafra, currently occupied by Nigeria, and insisting on the release of Nnamdi Kanu, Radio Biafra freedom broadcaster and leader of the indigenous people of Biafra, illegally detained by the Nigerian regime. Biafrans are redefining the dynamics of the march for freedom in Africa. Biafra will be free. This march will be intensified in days and weeks and months ahead, and will have progressive, liberatory consequences across Africa. The freedom movement should now embark on organizing a binding referendum in which all electorally eligible Biafrans from its population of 50 million at home and in the diaspora in Nigeria and elsewhere in the world vote on whether they want to belong to the Biafra state or Nigeria. Biafrans and all peoples of goodwill in the world will respect and accept the outcome of this democratic exercise, such as we have seen recently in Scotland. Unlike the Igbo, Scotland is not seeking freedom from the United Kingdom, one of the world's most successful nations state, because it has been assailed by genocide or any other crimes from the Union. Of course not. On the contrary, Scotland has been a distinct beneficiary from the Union, including access to the gargantuan wealth seized by the Union across the globe during its centuries of conquests and occupations, which included Biafra and other regions of the African world. What Scotland seeks from the United Kingdom is freedom to be in the driving seat of their destiny, as Nicola Sturgeon, leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party and First Minister of Scotland, has memorably described it: the right of self-determination, which is inalienable, which is for all peoples, which is recognized by the United Nations. No peoples are therefore exempt from this right, whatever may be their status, experience, or circumstance in the state from which they wish to exit. For the Igbo, 50 years on, 29 May is indeed a beacon of the resilient spirit of human overcoming of the most desperate, unimaginably brutish forces. It is a new Igbo national holiday. It is a day of meditation and remembrance in every Igbo household in Biafra and in the diaspora in Nigeria and the rest of the world. Gratitude and thanksgiving for those who survived, and the collective Igbo rededication to achieve the expectant goal of the restoration of Igbo sovereignty, Biafra. Now is the time. Igbo will never forget. Happy survival, land of the rising sun.